dreaming about you all for the last 6 weeks. Not some amorphous audience, but you, people that are specifically here. So I want to take a moment to see you. And because of the reality that we are living in, a moment of fascism, isolation, backlash, and disconnection, I want to ask you a question from Daniel Alexander Jones's Love Like Light. How is your heart? Don't rush, really check. And as you listen for the answers, what arises might surprise you. It might be quiet or loud, tender or raw, whatever it is. Meet it with curiosity, not judgment. Our hearts hold truths, and so do our workplaces, creative spaces, and institutions. And just like our hearts hold the imprint of our experiences, our joys, our wounds, our longings, so too do our creative lineages hold and reflect the values and histories of those who built them. When we don't slow down to really question and ask the impact of our actions, we risk replicating the very harms we claim to resist, mistaking urgency for progress and habit for truth. We risk moving through the world on autopilot, accepting circumstances that diminish us, and exerting the same conditions on the spaces we shape. But before I talk about that, I want to take a moment to tell you a very quick story. When I was a kid, we used to have cookouts all the time, and I love sweets, especially cakes, pastries, bread. And my mom's friend brought a homemade cake. Oh, I have eyes on that cake. I wanted a piece so badly, but my mother wouldn't let me have it. In fact, she kept it in the kitchen, separate from the rest of the food. And the next day, I knew I would finally get a slice. But when I went searching for the cake, it was gone. Oof, vanished. And so I searched for it a little bit, went and gave up, and then I ate my breakfast, and as I'm like scraping my plate into the trash, there it is, the entire cake, sitting in the garbage. Indignant, I asked my mother, who threw it away? She didn't even hesitate. She said, I did. Why, Mom? Because that woman's house and kitchen are filthy, and you better not tell her I threw it away. And that story kind of reminds me of theater. So many people experience the final product with no knowledge of how it was made. Few know about the racist remarks, the retaliation, the power hoarding, the lack of resources, the silencing, the anti-blackness and exploitivity that permeates the process. And there's a code of silence in theater. People are afraid to speak up because the jobs are too few, and retaliation is real, especially if folks of the global majority. For the longest time, I thought that change would come when the right white people finally decided to do the right thing. Focusing all my energy on the harms that I was experiencing, I inadvertently placed all my power in the hands of others. And when the change didn't come, when the silence stretched on, when the harm continued, when my resentment became unmanageable, I decided to point the finger back at myself, asking, where am I complicit? What do I need to shift and change about how I show up and operate in these spaces? First, I needed to depersonalize as much as I could and really focus in on getting clearer about what characteristics were integral to how the spaces function. In other words, what exists in the space whether I am present or not, and some simple truths emerged. The theater industrial complex is racist. Racism is a form of abuse. Abuse causes harm. These are not controversial statements, they are facts. And if theater makers can accept these truths, then they can finally start practicing something other than rote harm. And recognizing harm is a first step. However, the real work lies in transforming how we create, collaborate, and care for one another. I created anti-racist theater not as a checklist or a toolkit, but as a response to the persistent obstacles impacting my career and well-being. Art, is a healing technology for the harms all theater makers encounter in the field. This approach asks us to examine our instincts, our values, our traumas, versus the ways that we have been conditioned to move through the world and ignore them. It asks us to look more deeply into our creative practices. And in order to do that, we need to experience some discomfort through growth. And then our transformation, well, that we have to practice. But we can do either without clarity. So this approach it draws from transformative justice, somatics, organizing, the work of activists, artists, and facilitation techniques and cultural workers who have always woven compassion and anti-racist analysis to reframe and refocus on the needs of the most targeted and empathy into how they challenge systems, disrupt oppression, and model for us that dissent, it conjures possibility. So there are some few questions that I want to ask for you. I want to ask you all, okay? When you enter into a creative space, are there unspoken rules that you follow? Who do those rules serve? How do you define artistic excellence? Where did that definition come from? Who is included and who is excluded? Has there ever been a time when you were in a creative process where you compromised your instincts to address harm that was happening in the process? What was at stake? What did you lose? Where do your values guide your creative practice? Are they truly yours, or have they been shaped by a system that benefits from your silence or compliance? Where does anti-Blackness get activated in your own practice, whether through silence, complicity, or avoidance? Where in the creative process do you prioritize control over trust? How does that impact the people that you work with? And then lastly, when conflict arises in collaboration, do you seek resolution or dominance? How have you been taught, to respond to creative tension? Does that response differ for BIPOC colleagues than it does for white colleagues? If you are ready to move beyond superficial gestures and into a real practice that liberates you and others, then you need to know, show, and grow. Know what your anti-racist theater ethos is, so it can inform your creative practice. Be honest about what engaging in healing will cost you spiritually, mentally, and physically. Don't underestimate it. Know where your support is coming from so you don't exhaust out of the work. Show up with the courage to move at the pace of contradiction, partnering with time, but also being guided by a rhythm of grace. Show your work, not just in words, but in evolving practices. Grow equity, not as a one-time initiative, but as a living practice. Equity isn't a policy change, it's a relationship change. And like any relationship, it requires maintenance, repair, and renewal. An anti-racist theater ethos has expanded how I move through the world. I'm more inclusive, more culturally aware. I listen more deeply. I communicate my needs with greater transparency. It's taught me to be more aware of my body and spaces and how it responds to and shapes the dynamics of the room. I'm more aware of my positional power and how I can use it to cultivate equity and not control. It's also taught me that there are very few people's anti-racist transformation I need to be an active participant in. Sometimes it's enough to just share what I know and move on. But perhaps most importantly, it has taught me to make space for myself as a Black woman, to make mistakes, to practice accountability, to be in a position to redefine belonging in the context of work, to stay grounded in the loving release of what I not change. What I'm proposing to you all is lifelong work. How do we decouple ourselves from loveless systems while still living and working in them? How do we imagine the vital support necessary to move against oppression and towards liberation? Where is the collective communal health that will allow us to rest as a necessary element of creation? Let us remember the invitation that we hold in this moment to listen more deeply, not just to each other, but to our hearts and to the spaces we inhabit, to show up fully in all of our dignity and engage with the world as it is while still striving for the world as it could be. I leave you with a final question. What's one small pivot that you can make that moves you closer to your wholeness? Reclaiming the parts you were told to suppress for success, and further away from the transactional, the exploitative, the extractive. Audre Lorde said, without community, there is no liberation. So how do we design intentional, fertile spaces that will allow us to honor our collective healing and shared power? This work, it's messy, chaotic, iterative, but it is ours to do, and it is this very process that will birth a more just theater and a more just world. I understand how difficult it can be to surrender deeply entrenched behaviors, especially when they are wrapped in memory, comfort, and survival. But healing requires that we relinquish our reliance on outdated ways of being, old patterns, and systems that bind us to harm. Trust that when you let go, you make space for something that is more embodied, more honest, more free, more collective, and in that space, you will meet a more healed version of yourself.